Indiana soybean checkoff dollars support you with many, many, many tools to help you get the most out of your bean. Activate your membership at indianabeanbenefits.com.
Welcome to another Better Farming Report, research-based resources to help you farm more profitably and productively. Made possible by Hoosier Ag Today and the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture. I'm Gary Truitt, and Indiana soybean farmers and their checkoff making this program possible. We are coming to you today from the Throckmorton Research Farm just south of Lafayette. And joining me, Jim Mintert from the Center for Commercial Agriculture and Extension Weed Specialist Bill Johnson. And yes, we are going to talk about weeds today. We are literally outstanding in a field looking at some weeds, and we're going to talk about how you can control weeds and control costs. Throughout the series, Jim, we have talked about what farmers need to do to reduce costs, but not reduce yields. And weed control costs, certainly a significant part of any farming operation, particularly soybean acres this coming year. But really, corn and soybean farmers both facing significant input costs in controlling weeds. But can they cut? What can they cut? What is the cost of not doing a good job on weed control? And you have run some of the numbers to show us exactly how important a good weed control program is.
Well, that's right, Gary. In fact, in agriculture, we spend a lot of time talking about cost per acre. But I think especially when we look at something like weed control, it's especially important to look at it on a cost per bushel basis, because the cost of inadequate weed control can be very high in terms of the impact on reduced yields. So if you look at it from that standpoint, when we look at our budgets, for example, looking at, for example, West Central Indiana, kind of a high yield environment, starting off with a yield of maybe around 65 bushels per acre, variable cost per bushel plus the cash rent cost per bushel in our budgets is around $7.50 or $7.60 per bushel. If you reduce yields because you had poor or weed control, for example, cutting those yields about 30%, which in round numbers would be a reduction of about 20 bushels per acre, that bumps that per bushel variable cost plus cash rent up to about $10.50 or $10.60 per bushel. So about a $3 per bushel increase in your cost because of a 30% reduction in yield, attributable perhaps to some poor weed control. So it's really important to look at cost per bushel, not cost per acre, because as we moved into an environment where we do have resistant weeds, sometimes our cost per acre might actually be going up. But that's going to be an effective way perhaps to hold down our cost per bushel.
Right. Finding ways to cut costs is something that producers have been asking and talking about all winter long as we head to the field this spring. Bill, you've been getting lots of calls from producers saying, what do I not have to do? What can I cut? And what are the answers you've been giving them?
Well, that's a great question, Gary. And one of the things that we've been promoting hard the last couple of years is to have growers use residual herbicides as part of their soybean weed control programs. And the reason we're promoting the use of residual herbicides is the fact that we have some very good chemistry out there that we haven't yet developed resistance to, and the fact that most of these products are off patent, and so the cost per unit of product is relatively low. The other benefit to using residual herbicides is getting early season weed control, and you minimize the weed competition with the crop. Now, the reality of the soybean herbicide market is that many of the soybean herbicides are premixes of products, and they're usually 2 or 3 different active ingredients. So many growers have been asking, can I cut one of those active ingredients out if I can find the individual component herbicides, and will that save me some money? So the answer to that is yes, you can, if you know what weeds you're targeting in every field. So the way these soybean herbicides are built with 2 or 3 AIs per product is they're built to be a broad spectrum herbicide to control a couple of dozen different weeds, and you don't have to know the weeds in your field all that well in order to make them work. Once you start cutting out active ingredients, you're going to lose control of some species. So it really gets back to the grower to know what weeds specifically they're targeting if they're going to try to reduce one of those AIs. And so it does make weed control a little more challenging.
And certainly a number of factors have come into play the last couple of years that have an impact on weed control, and that's even some of the various tillage techniques that we have. And so you have looked at how some of the changes we're doing in agriculture, not only changes from a weather standpoint, but changes from a production standpoint, is having an impact on weed control and some of the adjustments we need to make in the way we manage our weed control program.
Well, that's correct. If we go back 20 years, as we adopted more no-tillage in the state, we became more reliant on using the herbicide glyphosate for weed control on these no-till acres. What happened with over-reliance on glyphosate was a rapid proliferation of weeds like mare's tail that are resistant to glyphosate. So some growers brought tillage back into their management equation, which was very effective for managing mare's tail, but obviously increased the cost and increased the potential for soil erosion. The big questions we're getting now is, how does vertical tillage influence weed control? And the simple answer to that is that vertical tillage doesn't stir up the soil well enough to really be thought of as a weed control tactic. There are other benefits to using vertical tillage as far as breaking up the hard pan, but from a weed control standpoint, it's really not adding anything to the equation.
We have seen in Indiana a significant increase in the use of cover crops. This last year, almost a 10% increase in the acreage for cover crops. How does the burn down of cover crops and weed control going forward in a year like this really work out?
Well, that's an excellent question as well. Fortunately, we're coming into a period now in late April where we have ideal weather conditions for terminating our cover crops to get our summer annual crops planted. Now, the challenge for some growers is the fact that some of these cover crops have gotten relatively tall, and terminating a taller cover crop is more difficult, and the burn down can be slower. It may take higher herbicide rates, or they may have to be reapplied or retreated in order to get effective control. So the key thing to keep in mind with cover crops is they are much more difficult to terminate after the crops have emerged. And so for the growers that want to plant green into these cover crops, we really discourage that strategy because there are fewer tools that you can use to terminate a cover crop once the corn or soybean plants have emerged. So we're really encouraging growers to be aggressive on treating the cover crops early, making sure they're using high enough herbicide rates, making sure the carrier volumes are high enough where they get good coverage, and simply get these things terminated before they plant their crops.
Now, there is the big issue of weed resistance, and we're going to dedicate an entire separate video to the issue of weed resistance. But Jim, to wrap things up here, the key here, again, as you have stressed in some of our other videos, is management. How do we manage our weed control program just as we have some of our seed issues and seed decisions over the winter to maximize production but minimize those costs?
Well, now, if you think about some of the things Bill was just talking about, one of the things he was stressing was your knowledge of the weed species that are present, making sure that your herbicide program is really targeted to deal with the problems you have. That's clearly an effective strategy. And the other thing, I think, is to not focus so much on eliminating products or cutting rates. It's about doing everything you can to have the best weed control. And that's probably how you're going to be able to reduce your cost per bushel, is really to maximize yields by having very, very good weed control.
All righty. Jim Mintert from the Center for Commercial Agriculture at Purdue, and Bill Johnson, Extension Weed Specialist from the Throckmorton Farm. This is your Better Farming Report, made possible by your Indiana soybean growers. The Center for Commercial Agriculture has some great resources. The web address is on our site, or is on the screen right now. Also visit the Hoosier Ag Today website for the latest farm news, markets, and all important crop conditions as we go through the 2016 growing season. For the Better Farming Report and Indiana soybean farmers, I'm Gary Truitt.
Indiana soybean checkoff dollars support you with many, many, many tools to help you get the most out of your bean. Activate your membership at indianabeanbenefits.com.